The following is a presentation of Project Independence and WCWP. Project Independence is the Aging in Place initiative of the town of North Hempstead. We provide programs and services designed to assist and support the older town residents who wish to remain in their homes as they age. If we don't currently provide a service, we will try and connect you to that service. Call 311 or 869-6311 to get more information or receive services.
Welcome to Project Independence and You.
Welcome to Project Independence and You. I'm your host, John Ryan, and my co-host today is Otto Lowe's.
Morning, John.
And we have a very, very special show today. Now, everybody knows that since COVID began, we also have this on the TV. And I don't really like to read too many things, but I definitely do not want to not give Oscar his due. So our guest today is Oscar Michelen, who is a partner at the firm of Cuomo LLC. Oscar graduated, finishing in the top 5% from New York Law School, and he also served as the editor of the New York Law Review. He was in various different practices, and then it was in 2010 that he joined Cuomo as a member, and since has graduated. That's the wrong word, graduated, but nevertheless, he is now a partner in the firm. A couple of things that Oscar works on there, and we're going to talk about them all today. One, he works on civil and commercial litigation, which is very important, and people are hearing more and more about it today, but many people don't understand it. He recently founded an employment law practice that defends small and mid-sized businesses, and that, in this day and age, with all these monster corporations, is very, very important. But, and we will get to this last, and not the most important thing, but one thing that makes Oscar stand out above so many men in his field is he has been able to get 6 people exonerated from death row, murder cases. He's been on Netflix movie, which is amazing. And the point is, it's a passion of his, but when you sit here today and with everything that's going on in the world, 6 men, I think it was a man, it could have been a woman, we'll talk about that. But nevertheless, the lives that were affected when these guys came home, the number of people touched because of his work, his ethic, I mean, it's just mind-boggling. And he's also was born in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. And that in itself, I want to touch upon. With all the craziness going on in the world today, you know, New York City is not the only place where people are born and become successful, caring attorneys. Good morning, Oscar.
Good morning, John. Good morning, Otto. Thank you for having me on.
No, thank you so much for agreeing to this. This is absolutely wonderful. I want to start, and Otto always does his homework and jumps in any time. You were born in the Dominican Republic. When did you come over here?
I came over very young. What's that?
When and how?
Yeah, so my family and I immigrated to the United States in the early 60s. We came actually under political asylum. We had to leave in a hurry. There was a dictator named Rafael Trujillo who had been overthrown, and his government was replaced by a very violent military junta. And what actually happened was there was a very large demonstration to overthrow the junta, and it was covered by the paper, and lo and behold, my father was in the middle at the front of the crowd trying to overthrow the military junta. He was very identifiable. This is the days before the internet. And so he knew that his days in the DR were numbered. Several of his close friends were murdered and tortured by the junta. And so we packed up a couple of steamer trunks, and he convinced his sister-in-law and nieces to come with us so that we wouldn't look like the family they might be looking for. It was 10 of us coming over, and even though there were only 5 of us in the family.
Okay.
And we came to the United States, and then he became a physician here, and we continued to live in New York ever since then.
That's wonderful. And also, in reference to your dad, I know I saw something, I didn't catch it 100%, like within the last 6 months, there was a street or something named for your dad?
Yes, up in Washington Heights. You know, when my father came here, there was not a large Dominican community. Most of the Hispanics and Latinos in New York were Puerto Rican. The Dominicans didn't really start coming in numbers until the 80s. But my father, very early on, started to coalesce the Dominican community. He was politically active in the Dominican Republic. He became politically active here. He ended up founding several Dominican cultural and humanitarian organizations. He was the founding member of the Dominican Day Parade and its first Grand Marshal, and opened up a series of medical clinics for the poor in Washington Heights that are still there today. He was the founder of Ostos Community College and its first president, which is not in the Heights, but is in the Bronx, in a very, very Latino neighborhood. So, this was a recognition of all the work he had done for the Latino community at large and the Dominican community specifically. So they named a street corner in Washington Heights after him. It was marvelous testament to all the work he did.
That's amazing. And you know what, also, and we're going to be talking about this later in the show, it's amazing because as altruistic as your dad was, it gets passed on. I mean, some of the stuff that you do, obviously comes because you watch the man that you respected and say, my God, if daddy can do it, why can't I do a little something extra for somebody versus,
Yeah, my father was always family first and then service, community second. We always were out at events, doing things, always letting us know that not everybody had it as good as we did.
Okay.
Be thankful for what we had and to try to make the community a better place.
Just going back also, when you said, when you guys came in from the Dominican Republic, was that difficult then? Because it was more Puerto Rican at the time? I mean,
oh yeah.
Did you get along? No, there was definitely different factions, so to speak.
It was just that no one had ever heard of Dominican Republic. We've always thanked baseball for putting us on the map. At that time, it was Juan Marichal and the Alou brothers that people finally got to know who we were. But you're not going to believe this, but when you would fill out forms, the forms would say white, black, Puerto Rican. And my brothers were a lot older than me, 7 and 9. They would always tell me, listen, you draw a little box and you write Dominican. If it says Latino or Hispanic, you could check that. But if it says Puerto Rican, draw a little box and you write Dominican, because we got to be in there. So, eventually in the 80s, by that time, and really, all joking aside, the prevalence of Dominican baseball players made people more aware of the island.
I'm not a baseball fan, but that name you said, the first name, I did hear of him.
Yes, the Dominican Dandy was what he was called. Otto may remember Juan Marichal, one of the greatest pitchers of all time.
Well, Juan Marichal, is he the guy who was involved with Roseboro, the catcher for the Brooklyn Dodgers? They had an incident that
that's it.
I was a big Brooklyn Dodger fan.
He pitched for the Giants, so yes.
Yes, I know who he is.
What was the
actually? I played golf with the foursome right before him, right here in Queens. Actually, Douglaston. He played golf there. There was a guy who knew him quite well, and he was a nice guy.
Yes, he was. Yes, we had met him a couple of times.
I can relate to the immigration part of it. I'm first generation, different German, but had similar problems when I was a kid. Back then, that wasn't so accepted, especially when World War II started. That didn't go over too big.
No.
And I remember being called many things that I didn't like. And, I can very much relate to people who immigrate into this country.
Yeah, we all have to remember that for whatever the next wave that will come in and try to make a better life for themselves here. That's what the country's all about.
Yep.
I have a very good friend, a Jewish friend, and she's 84 years old. And her father was the largest peacoat maker during World War II in the country. Anyway, he took her up one day, and I'll always remember this story. He took her to Harlem and looked around, and he said, the only difference between them and you is nobody knows you're a Jew. And he says, you can get it. She's blonde. I mean, people think she's Irish, but he says, don't ever think you're better than anybody. And these people are being abused because they stick out. If they found out who you were, they're going to come after you the same. And this is, obviously World War II and everything else. And it's just that, as she said, it stuck with her. And, we talk about the different stuff, but it's just, I mean, even today now, unfortunately, in quasi situation, I have three daughters, two of which have converted to Judaism. I have six grandchildren, five of which are Jewish. It's a spooky time. My partner Peter, who will be on the show later, I mean, he's Jewish and he basically says all the time. He had his license plate as a joke was Latka. He changed it and went back to a regular license plate. He said, I don't want that on my car.
No, it's you would think that we would have gotten over a lot of these sentiments, including especially anti-Semitism after all these years. But no, you see that it's still prevalent and something that we have to every day fight against. That's why we love it here in North Hampstead. We have not in our town. It's a very strong message that we send. That
I remind my family all the time that during World War II, I was between the ages of 4 and 10 during that whole stretch. And I remind my family that had we not looked different, we would have wound up like the Japanese people in internment camps, because the only difference was we didn't look different in theory compared to other people. And I remind my kids of that and grandchildren that, very easily my family could have ended up in internment camps if they would look different, quote unquote.
And people, just really quickly, John, because I know we have to get to, but one of my best friend's fathers came during World War II from Italy, and people don't know Italians were interned when they first got here. He was put in camp, had to wear a jacket that said "enemy" on the back, and he tells a great story that several years later he gets drafted for the Korean War, and he says to them, "I was enemy. You can't draft me. I was an enemy 5 years ago." And I said to him, "Well, how did that turn out?" And he pointed to this picture on the mantle of him and two other Italian guys making coffee on a frozen mountain in Korea. He goes, "This is how it ended up. Because this country, pazzo, he goes, crazy." He said, "So yeah," he goes, "I was an enemy, and then they put a rifle in my hand."
From that point of view, and it's a shame, it's not a tangent, because when we talk about stuff on the show, we just talk, but it is so pathetic that it really is, it's the color. If you stick out in the crowd, they can hate you easier than if you blend in with everybody. They have no idea what you're on. You could be the most violent, vicious, killer, prejudiced, racist, whatever you are. Makes no difference. You're a white boy or girl or whatever it is, but your skin's a little darker or there's something a little different about you. And even that goes to special needs kids. I mean, they get ostracized too in a different way. My wife's a special needs teacher. It's heartbreaking sometimes, the story she comes home with.
Very true.
And it's not going to change, unfortunately. I mean, I shouldn't say that. You have to be positive for the future. I think my oldest grandson is 10. He's a good boy, because my daughter constantly, if you don't say something nice about somebody, don't say it. The years of picking on somebody and being a bully and making fun of the fat kid, the short kid, the kid who wore glasses, or whatever it was, they're gone. The teachers even have a lot less tolerance for it. And you have to.
Yep, very important.
You can't just keep making fun. And Oscar we're going to call Oscar the attorney with heart, because that's really what he is. And we're talking about his history and his background. But now I want to talk, Oscar, in reference to the actual law that you practice. So people listening today can turn around and say, I have none of that, so therefore I can't use Oscar. Or guess what? That's something, something I'm having an issue with. I should reach out to Oscar.
So we're litigators, which means that we generally handle cases that are brought in court against someone in state or federal court. We practice a lot in both areas, all 5 boroughs, Nassau, Suffolk, and we're even called from time to time out of state, depending on the matter. And what we focus on predominantly is representing businesses in all kinds of disputes. People will be surprised how many federal laws, regulations, state laws, state regulations are passed on a regular basis that affect businesses and give people claims essentially against those businesses of all types. And so we have focused on helping particularly small and mid-sized businesses kind of navigate this new, like a legal minefield. Predominantly a lot of focus on employment law and a lot of focus on business disputes, folks who may have been partners. It's kind of like a business divorce, we would call it.
Okay.
So you and your cousin went into business, love was in the air when it was first formed. Now you find out that, he's using the corporate credit card to go on vacation while you're working, 40 hours a day in your restaurant, things of that nature. And really over the last year, we've really been helping people with getting through COVID in making sure that they apply properly for their the PPP loans, the small business loans, letting them, helping them navigate with their landlords, particularly those of our clients who are in Manhattan. For example, a lot of leases, might not let you pay, might let you not pay rent if there's what they call a force majeure or an act of God. A lot of businesses have business interruption insurance. So does COVID apply to those interruptions? And the real problem is the big businesses, they have enough money not to worry about it and to get by. And B, they have access to, the largest law firms in the country. We focus on small to mid-sized businesses where they don't have a legal budget in their annual budget. That when a lawsuit comes or a problem like this comes, it's not an anticipated expense. So it can be really difficult, for them to handle it. So we offer a variety of ways to try to help them navigate that, keep their costs down, and give them the same level of work that the big boys get. We litigate against some of the largest firms in the country, on a regular basis.
Right. And I know right now, because I obviously have different friends, both as attorneys and in the courts, it's tough work in the courts right now. You're not having an easy go of it.
Yeah, the courts are essentially closed. Even criminal cases have been basically shuttered. There are no jury trials. But the problem is now you have a legal problem. Like, what can you do to get help right away? So there are some emergency courtrooms that are open for that type of relief. We brought a couple of those. Now there's a moratorium on eviction, so that helped. But early on, some landlords were trying to get very aggressive and throw businesses out or demand the use of the security, for example, to pay the rent when the restaurant was shuttered down. And we had to defend against that, to say, no, that's not what the security is for. If I had a business, I've never missed a rent payment for 5 years. The only reason I'm missing a payment is because my restaurant is closed down by government order. You can't do that to me. You can't say, oh, here's a letter saying, thanks, I just took your last 2 months security deposit. So, the COVID pandemic certainly has affected all of our lives, but small businesses have been so strongly impacted and have really needed legal help to navigate them through the processes that are there for them.
I go into the city often enough through this whole situation, and the city's empty. I mean, it really is. And some of the coffee shops that I used to pass along the way, they're all out of business, a little mom. And there was one, they had a huge sign on the window. It was so heartbreaking. It said, "We tried, but we couldn't do it." Oh, it made me sick. I mean, I used to get coffee there. It was a little mom and pop thing. Nothing. I'm sure these people weren't sitting and owning the building, but
Exactly.
you can only try so much. And there's nobody on the streets. I mean, there's more today than there was, say, 3 or 4 months ago. But we're still not talking of booming Manhattan anymore. That's for sure.
No, and what's sad is it was kind of the last straw. Pre-pandemic, Manhattan rents had been their highest ever. And if you walk through Manhattan, I used to love to walk from the courthouse downtown to our office midtown. I would walk. It'd be several miles, but on a nice day, sometimes I even took city bike. And every neighborhood was different. It was like almost a trip around the world. And you would go into, it'd be a Ukrainian neighborhood. You didn't even know there was a Ukrainian neighborhood. Then the next neighborhood would be Vietnamese and so on. Now, because of the rent prices, it's all national businesses by and large. So it's one Starbucks next to a Jamba Juice, next to a CVS, and the small different stores. When my cousins from around the country used to come and they'd ask for a good recommendation for a restaurant, let's say they're staying in Manhattan at X address, I would say to them, if they're open, see how long they've been open. If they've been there for 5 years, it's the best food of that kind you've ever eaten. You're from Iowa. Okay, just walk right in. You don't need a recommendation.
Okay.
If a single restaurant has survived in New York for 5 years, it's got good food. Just trust me, because otherwise it'd be out. And I miss that. You really miss those types of places. They're getting a little smaller and smaller. And COVID was the last straw for a lot of them. I had many restaurant clients who wrote, who came to me for help and then said, you know what?
We're
Give
done.
me a bankruptcy lawyer. Yeah, and refer them to bankruptcy lawyers because
I'm in your camp when it comes to, I love walking in Manhattan. I always have uh, long distances. And I hate to see what it's going to look like. Just pick a street, Restaurant Row, 46th Street.
one of my favorites.
Broadway's closed since March. It's not going to open maybe in June, they said. Those places, most of them are going to be shut. It's going to really take a long, long time.
Yeah, and to get back to what John said, also, it's the same. We represent building owners. And so when you think of building owners in Manhattan, you may think of, very large, developers. But the fact is that we have a couple of families that for their whole life have owned one building, in Manhattan, which, by the way, is a great business. 20 apartments in Manhattan. You could sustain a family for that. But that's all they've got. And then all of a sudden, those tenants can't pay rent. But you still got to pay the taxes, the mortgage against the building. You have to maintain the building. They really need relief as well. So, we've seen a lot of business owners that have had to go to banks and add on additional debt. And can you imagine you have family, you own the building on St. Mark's Place. This is one of the places downtown Manhattan that we had. It's been in your family for years. You have no rent on it anymore because your family has owned it for 80 years. And you have very little debt on it. Now you have to pile on debt to keep it afloat, to keep the tax payments going, to keep the maintenance on the building. So there are, things that we do that we help people navigate that and give them a little bit of sense of relief and some time. Particularly that first tranche of the PPP money, disappeared so quickly that when the next tranche became available, that's when we really started to help a lot of businesses make sure they got in and got some money to keep them afloat. But more is definitely needed because we're not out of the woods yet by any means.
It's far from it. And the other thing too, my partner Peter and I talk about it, and we have clients, fortunately, with real estate, but they've had it for years and they've been conservative. They're down 20 and 25% on rentals, but they can handle it. The city still wants their taxes. So if you turned around and said everybody could push everything back, they'd be fine. They're still paying their taxes, so they have to go out of pocket. Fortunately, it's a business they've had for years, so they have the money.
Right.
But the poor person who maybe 2 or 3 years ago said, let's get into real estate, and you put your 15 or 20% down and you bought a building because at sky high prices, thinking, guess what? In 20 years, I'll be fine.
Yeah.
Now your tenants are out. Those are the ones that people might turn around and say, oh, those poor, that's bankruptcy coming. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
I can't imagine how much money's involved with, like where the vessel is on the west side, where they have all these huge new buildings, and there was lots of construction going on, high rent tenants.
Yep.
I can't imagine how many billion is going to be involved with that whole thing.
Yeah, it's very sad because we did have a client, who just opened up there in Hudson Yards, is what you're talking about.
Hudson Yards is
so here
what
it
I'm
is. They
looking
just
for.
think, how exciting you finally decided to go into business, and, we help form the corporation. We do all of that work and get them all their licenses, whatever they might need. They're ready to open. They get the hottest neighborhood, in New York. It was in the paper every day, Hudson Yards, and people were flooding to the place. They were really excited. And then 2 months later, shut down. They opened in January and they were shut down in March. And,
Wow.
Will they ever get that investment back? Several hundreds of thousands of dollars. They got about $150,000 in the PPP loan. That was a drop in the bucket compared
Right.
to what they needed and what they lost. And they had, from top to bottom, about 20 employees, at good salaries, and just had to shut down. They're still closed. They don't know what they're going to do. The only good thing there is that the landlord is in such the same shape that no one's asking them for money. They recognize that there's just nothing there to be had. So they're waiting to see what happens if some money comes in, and then they can, hopefully just turn the key back on.
Wow. My son-in-law who owns a Tiger. No, yeah, he's owns 90% of a Tiger Showman on Long Island. Actually, he's going to be on in a couple of weeks. He got, of course, he closed down, et cetera, et cetera. But his landlord came to him 2 or 3 months ago. He was keeping up. He kept up with the rent, even though there was nobody in there. He did the honorable thing. He worked hard, and the landlord came to him and cut his rent in half. And
Yeah.
he said, "You've been paying me. I tell you what, let's make it. And when things turn around down the road, I don't want you looking for someplace else. You're an honorable person. I can handle it." He's doing half rent until who knows when, maybe another couple of months, maybe 6 months. But that's a landlord then that you respect and want to stay with also.
Well, that's it.
You know, if you have to do it, keep the guy.
This literally is, I think very soon we're going to pass more deaths via COVID than World War II. But World War II is the most similar scenario when we had a ration, when we had everyone was geared towards a national goal. And it has to be a national goal to help small businesses, building owners, the people who really generate the economy survive through this. So it's very critical. And, we're glad to help with the process. And then the last thing you need is when you get sued and then you got to go to court. So, we're here for you if that need ever arises for anybody.
Perfect. We are having a wonderful, wonderful conversation with Oscar Michelen. First, we talked about his family coming over many years ago as immigrants and where the whole family has gone since then. And they have made major contributions to the city. Then his career with Cuomo LLC and what he's doing very specifically for the small businesses. And now this part is just staggering. Oscar has helped exonerate 7 men from various different separate murder cases. And his work has actually been a movie with Netflix, which is Fight for Justice, David and Me, and a podcast, Empire on Blood. And we got from the beginning of the show how Oscar's dad was a very altruistic, loving person and did things for the community. And obviously, like father, like son. And Oscar, this is just amazing. We're back now with Oscar Michelen. And here's where we're going. I know you have questions, but I'm at a loss for words because this is just so amazing.
I'm actually, I just have a philosophical statement to make, all right? I really respect him for doing what he's doing. I have never been in jail, but I have had to visit a few times, and I didn't even like that, all right? So I can only imagine if you're sitting in jail for 20 years, 30 years, or maybe the rest of your life, and you were not guilty, what that has to be like. That has to be hell on earth, really. I just can't imagine it.
I said something at the break, and I mean it very sincerely. Most people listening know I have cancer. It's taken 2.5 years from my life away. Here you have somebody who's healthy and vibrant and in a cell for 20 plus years. I have no idea. I know the pain I go through in my head sometimes. I have no idea what that poor person's going through. Oscar, we're turning it over to you. First of all, how'd you get involved in anything like this?
So yeah, thank you. It's obviously it's very frustrating and rewarding work at various times, depending on which stage of a particular case you get me on. Back in the early 90s and into the 2000s, I did a lot of criminal defense. That was where I learned how to litigate. And the administrative judge of the County of Queens, a guy named Stephen Fisher, reached out to one of my associates, happened to be in the hallway, and said, "Could you have Mr. Michelen look into this case of Angelo Martinez? The DA thinks he might be wrongfully convicted. He's been writing letters, and he needs a lawyer, pro bono." And I was like, "Who is this judge that wants me to do pro bono work? I'm trying to build a business, And I got involved in that case. And Angelo went in at 18. He'd been incarcerated for 19 years. And through a long story short, we established that the real killer was actually a Russian hitman for the Russian mob. And we vacated his conviction and we got him out after 19 years. So once that happened, I got a flood of letters. It was in the paper. This was really the popularity of the internet. It was out there, but not as popular as it is now. And then I started going through these cases and I started picking cases that stood out to me as being wrongful convictions. And the one thing about COVID is it's let me get through. I had 150 pending requests for help, and we were able to answer everybody during the COVID pandemic to tell them, we'll get to you when we can, or no, we don't think that's the kind of case that we can get involved in. We generally look for, it has to be a murder case normally. There's no death row in New York, but you get life in prison, which means you're going to die in jail. So it's a different form of death row. And we also have to see that you have a family member on the outside. If nobody believes in you, why are we going to believe in you? So we want to have an outside contact. We then want to see what the path is. Why do you think you could prove your wrongful conviction? We get lots of letters that say, I'm innocent, you got to help me. What? That doesn't go anywhere. Really tell me there's a witness, who was never interviewed, or this material was never examined. When we don't do DNA cases. So when we get a request that has a DNA case, we refer that to the Innocence Project, which only does DNA. They don't generally do reinvestigation. So our cases are very difficult because, first of all, I do it kind of on the side. I'm the only one in the firm who does it. I don't use any of the office staff for it. I do everything, myself, if I hire an investigator perhaps, but the legal work and everything else is done by me, nights, weekends, or spare time type of thing. And to go back and look at a 20-year-old case, witnesses are dead. To think about these neighborhoods, right? It's not normally Beverly Hills and Fifth Avenue that you're talking about. You're talking about poor neighborhoods that were crime ridden, and so many times the witnesses you're looking for are gone. The evidence is gone. The neighborhood may have changed. So it's very, very difficult to establish that someone's innocent from 20 plus years ago, particularly where you don't have the internet, that social media say, and people weren't taking pictures of themselves every 5 seconds. So there just isn't a lot of evidence out there. So it's really difficult. For example, the average length of time on the cases that I work on is 5 years. So it's not like someone calls me or send a letter and then the next year they get out. The average, it's taken as long as 10 years on some. The least has been 3, and the average is about 5 years of reinvestigation. And many times it ends up being luck. The last case that we worked on, we were looking for a guy, this is like out of a movie, with one eye. At that time, there was a report that in addition to the one witness on the case, there was a guy with one eye from the neighborhood. And people knew him. He was kind of like a character from the neighborhood. But he was a transient. No one could find the guy. Ended up, he had moved to Massachusetts. So we did not know this because the real killers had intimidated him, burned his arm with a cigarette, and told him to get the F out of the Bronx. And so he left. That's why we couldn't find this guy. Guy is shopping on Fordham Road, and lo and behold, a friend of the defendant finds the one-eyed man in the store and says, "We've been looking for you for literally 20 years." And the guy says, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, my friend has been incarcerated for that murder." He said, "What? I went to court to try to tell the cops that I knew who did it. And afterwards, I got that's how we found that he'd been intimidated." So we found him. He gave a statement. We showed it to the Bronx DA's office, and they agreed to reinvestigate the case. When the Bronx DA's office opened the file to look at the case, they found that grand jury testimony had been withheld from the defense, and it was the victim's dying words to the woman who was holding him while he died after he shot. She said, "What happened? Who did this to you?" And he said, "It was a Spanish guy. Our client was an African-American black." When he was arrested, our client's statement to the police 22 years ago was, some Spanish guy shot him, and he gave a description. We had a 911 call back then that said the shooter is a Hispanic male. The judge did not let that call into evidence. And then we find the one-eyed witness. He gives us the description of this Hispanic male. And lo and behold, there's this grand jury testimony that shows the DA knew that the victim's dying words were, it was a Spanish male. In addition, we found another document from a caller, a guy named Mr. Rivera, who called, who was the police did like a canvas, so they go to the apartment building in front of where the shooting occurred, and he said, I saw this Spanish male pull a gun and shoot this guy. When we went back to him, when they went back to re-interview him, now that we found it, he said, I never said that to the police. I don't remember. He didn't want to get involved. But so there was all this evidence at the time pointing to the fact that our client wasn't the shooter. So, that was pure luck. Literally, just right place at the right time, running into this guy who had come back. His daughter had never left the Bronx. At that time, his daughter was 1. And he left. He left her with his, baby's mother, and he got the heck out of the Bronx. He came back to visit her. She was now grown. And he said, let me go on Fordham Road, do some shopping. And, if he decided to go into Starbucks instead or something, Mr. Larry McKee would still be in jail. So, there's a number of causes for wrongful conviction. But overturning wrongful conviction and reinvestigation, oftentimes you really need the hand of God there to just be lucky for you and find what you think you're looking for.
How does a district attorney live with that with good conscience, knowing that? I mean, you have, how can you be like that as a human being if you think about it?
Yeah.
It's terrible.
Well, especially when the New York State prison system, like you said, Otto, I couldn't do 20 days in New York State prison system for a crime that I did commit. I would not survive. It is a horrible place to be. All this false imagery that somehow our prisoners are up, have their feet up on couches and they're watching TV and playing bingo is nonsense. Well, for example, right now, I don't know if you know this, New York State inmates get 1 mask per week, and they are told to wash it and reuse it. Okay. There's no social isolation, and COVID is raging through the prison system. But beyond that, even in healthy times, it's just a miserable place. There's no medical care, gangs, the correction officers, some of them are helping the sale of drugs and other things, and gang operations in the New York State prisons. So one of the things that I found in all my guys, I don't know how they do it, but they always isolate themselves in prison. Every single one of my exonerees spent all their time in the law library. They just lived there working their cases and stayed out of trouble as much as possible. And that's always a sign too. When I try to decide like which case should I get involved in, all of them have filed motion after motion. The one that I'm currently working on, Andre Brown, also in the Bronx. Matter of fact, in my old neighborhood in the Bronx, Andre and I went to the same high school, different years. He's a little younger than me. Andre, I know you're not going to believe this. Andre wrote 1,100 letters for help.
Wow.
Okay, 1,100. He numbered them. One of the guys that I exonerated, a guy named Calvin Buari, also from the Bronx, also from my old neighborhood. When he got out, the first thing he said to me was, you got to look at, I don't care what else you're working on. You got to work on my man, Andre Brown's case. He's innocent. We've been in the law library working, you got to work on his case. And Andre wrote me, and the judge granted us a hearing. We were supposed to have the hearing the first week the last week of March, and of course COVID hit. So now we're waiting for that opportunity. But again, I wouldn't have gotten involved in Andre's case if he didn't happen to be a law library buddy with Calvin.
Right.
And I'm talking about the same day that I got Calvin out after 20 years.
And, there's really nothing we can say. We're going to go right back to Oscar because it's just amazing. The one story he's sharing, and he's done many of them, it's just, take it away, Oscar. I don't know what else to say.
Well, one of the things I'd like folks to realize, and maybe we can talk about, is, how does this, what are the causes? How does this happen? How, we pride ourselves on our criminal justice system being the fairest in the world. And I'm often reminded of the quote, I think it was Churchill's quote, saying democracy is the worst system in the world except for all others. And it's basically the same thing. Ours is the worst criminal justice system in the world except for all others. It is supposed to be very slanted towards protecting the innocent. We have protections in place that no other country has. You don't have to testify against yourself. You have the right to remain silent. No one can use that against you. The burden of proof is on the DA. The burden of proof is very high, beyond a reasonable doubt. So with all, you get a free lawyer, no matter what. So all of these protections are fantastic, but it's the application of them that results in unjust convictions. And science has really been very helpful in proving this. For example, one of the major causes of wrongful conviction is misidentification by an eyewitness. So when you were a juror and you go to trial, the heart of the moment, right, is that j'accuse, the guys on the witness stand says, that's the guy, I saw him. But it's been proven, first of all, that people are horrible identifiers of other people in stressful situations. Okay, they're horrible. They think that they're right. And then what happens is their guess is affirmed by the police, who show the photograph of the person, put that person in the lineup. Now you're not identifying who you saw that night, you're identifying that person. And now you go to court and you re-identify that person, not from the fact you saw him that night, a year or two before the trial. So an astonishing 75% of wrongful convictions involved a misidentification or an intentional misidentification by an eyewitness. So we need folks to understand that just because someone takes a stand and says that's the guy who did it, you got to ask, how did he get to that stand? How did he end up being the guy? And we've found everything from police misconduct to just plain mistake. For example, we have it in the Andre Brown case. We know who the real shooter is. He looks exactly like Andre. They could be brothers. The woman who saw the picture, the woman who identified Andre saw him literally less than 10 seconds, saw the shooter less than 10 seconds as he pulled up a ski mask and thought she recognized someone she knew from the neighborhood, Andre Brown. But no one ever showed her the guy, true killer, whose nickname was Bonkers, by the way, this drug dealer. And you put them side by side, they could be brothers. So misidentification, certainly. Science has also shown us that forensics that we had previously relied on, horrible. FBI agents should take the stand all the time and say, the bullet on the gun I found on the defendant, the metal matches the bullet that was taken from the body of the victim. People will be like, okay, that's it. Except that bullets in the United States are only made in 3 factories in the entire United States. So all the bullets practically have the same metal combination. And more often than not, even the examination, the FBI had to shut down that lab and no longer uses ballistics evidence. But people have been put away for decades based upon that testimony. Bite mark evidence. People used to be able to come and say, I matched it to the teeth. That has been completely disproven that you can't do that. They have shown that it was animal bites. They have shown that it was knife marks. They have shown that it was just abrasions from falling down the bank of a river. And some doctor took the stand and said the bite mark matches. And all of that comes from the fact of DNA evidence. DNA evidence has proven to us, definitively that people get wrongfully convicted. But it's also shown us the kind of bad evidence and bad assumptions, if you will, that have led to that. And one of the last things, in one of the cases that's most dear to my heart, David McCallum, is that DNA has proven that people, particularly young people, will falsely confess to a crime they didn't commit. And I would bet you that even today, with all the media attention around it and everything, if you would go to ask an average juror, would somebody ever confess to a murder if they didn't do the murder? And they would say, no, I wouldn't. Who would do that? But you see that through police interrogation techniques, police in New York State are allowed to lie to defendants. Back then, If you were 16 years old, you're treated as an adult. You have no right to a parent. You can be questioned by a police officer without a parent present. There's physical coercion, we've established. They're told all you got to do is say you saw the person do it, and you can walk out, so they don't realize that just putting themselves there implicates them in the crime. But people look at, for example, at Marty Tancliffe here on Long Island, one of the most famous wrongful conviction cases. His parents were murdered at night. He was asleep in his bedroom. The police believed he did it. They just suspected he was the only one else in the house. They told Marty, who was, I think, 17 at the time, the detective told him that his father's dying words were, "Marty did this." That did not happen. That's false. His father did not say that. And the detective said, "You must have blacked out. He must have been in some kind of stupor." And so they filled out a form for Marty to sign. And when he read it, he kind of snapped to it, like, "Wait a minute, I didn't black out. I never killed my parents." And he refused to sign. So he rejected the statement within 45 minutes of it being written and refused to sign it. But that was enough to convict him. And he did almost 20 years until he was able to get himself exonerated through finding all kinds of evidence pointing to the father's business partner as the likely assailant. But if you're 16, you're 17, and a police officer tells you that your father's dying words that you did it, you got to believe all kinds of things. That maybe you might have been in a stupor, you might have been in a dream, and so there's all kinds of reasons why people falsely confess. But on David, in one of my exonerations, where David McCallum and his co-defendant were 16, they got them to say that each of them, did the killing. So no one actually confessed to pulling the trigger. It took 10 years for us to get David out. He went in at 16 and he came out at 45. He did 29 years for a murder he didn't commit. His co-defendant, Willie Stuckey, died 16 years in from, we think it might have been a bad tattoo that led to blood poisoning because he got no medical treatment. But he never made it out. We still exonerated him. We still were able to establish that he didn't do it, and we cleared his name. But he never made it out of prison. David now, has a full life. He's got a daughter, but he lost. If you think about, John, think about in Otto, 16 to 45 that's your life, isn't it? That's when you become like who you are. You're really basically just a highly intelligent potted plant for the first 10 years. You're being fed by your parent. You don't have much of anything going on. And then you go to middle school, and everybody hates that. And now you're in high school. So that's when your life really starts and forms who you are as an adult. And by the time you're 45, you're pretty much who you are. So yes, it's 29 years, but I would argue it's also the most important 29 years of a person's life that get robbed. He never gave up. David was denied parole 3 times because he would not admit the crime. He was a model inmate. Okay. College classes, tutoring other people, never had a violation, was in the honors prison. But in New York State, you do not get parole until you admit your crime, no matter how much time you've served. So he was denied parole 4 times, just because he would not say he did it. And so, it's an incredible process. I want to see, I don't know if I can show this, but this is the day we got him out. It's his first step of freedom after 29 years of incarceration there in prison clothes.
Okay.
His mom, who just recently passed away, had brought us pound cakes, to celebrate his exoneration. It's just beautiful. We're really like family. We're still very close. And just so it's important for folks who get called to jury duty, people always ask me, what can we do to help? And the number one thing that I would say is, don't dodge jury service. So many people call me every day and say, how can I get out I got called for jury duty. I'm like, why do you want to get out? You know, this is important. You know, take the time. And, you know, if the person's guilty, vote guilty. You know, but we need people who have an open mind and are willing to think about things, listen to the evidence, and support the Constitution and hold up, you know, the burden of proof. Certainly, you can get involved in innocence organizations. You can contribute to things like that, but nothing's more important than just keeping an open mind and saying, "Let me, you know, really value the presumption of innocence." What does that really mean? You know, we talk about it in middle school, we learn about it in high school, but most people think that the guy or the woman there at the table is guilty, and that goes through the court system. You know,
Oscar, you're one person, and you can only help one or two people at a time.
right?
Are there other Oscars around? Like when I did the homework a little bit, Innocence Projects came up as one with a lot of DNA. Are there a lot of other attorneys or organizations that are trying to help people who are
Yes.
wrongfully incarcerated?
Yes, there's several. I mean, we work with the Midwest Innocence Project, which is not connected to the larger Innocence Project. The Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation, DESKOVIC. Jeff Deskovic is an exoneree. Jeff went in at 16. 18 years later, came out for the rape and murder of a high school classmate. DNA exonerated him. And not only did the DNA exonerate him, the DNA pointed to the actual murderer and rapist who had murdered and killed somebody else after this crime and after Jeff had gotten arrested. So one of the things that we forget is that the victims need wrongful convictions to get overturned as well, because they got the wrong man there for their crime. They don't have justice. And Jeff Deskovic's organization has exonerated several people. I work with him. So there's not enough because it's time consuming, particularly on reinvestigation, but there is what we call it the innocence community. You know, we all know each other. We all ask for help, and folks can get involved by doing what you did, Otto, search the net and look for organizations that, you know, need support and do the work, because they are out there.
Perfect. I know, unfortunately, we're out of time. Oscar, I don't think we've ever had anybody on that we didn't ask questions of. We just listened to you. It was amazing. And maybe when we show this on TV, Christina can get some of those organizations and we can add them to it. So this way, at the end of this, we can put them up. If anybody wants to call them, give a donation, anything like that. Oscar, all I can say is thank you, thank you, thank you. I commend you for your work. You're an exemplary human being, and you should be very proud of everything you do. And I'm sure your father is, you know, I'm not saying your father's here. I think he's passed on, but that's not the point. He's looking down and thinking, my God, I did a right job with this boy. You've been listening to Senior Talk Radio here on 88.1 FM and WCWP.org. Have a great weekend, everyone. And we'll be back here next week.